Welcome home to Passionate Justice. Passionate Justice 162 for the week of 28 January 2017. And again, excellent year to all of you. I am Jonathan Wolfman. Thank you so much for being with us this week on Our Salon Radio. And you know that at Our Salon Radio, we invite you to read with us, write with us, and of course you're not required to write if you are more comfortable reading, commenting, but I do think you will want to write. You may join the Our Salon readers and writers community. How many? Well over 1,100 superb writers and keen readers, personal essay, memoir, poetry, political, social justice, commentary, where? At www.oursalon.ning.com. I want you to join us because, as with all the best of life, membership at Our Salon is free. And now, Passionate Justice may be heard as well Monday night, 7 p.m. Pacific on APRI. What's that? Alternative Public Radio International. Look it up. APRI, Alternative Public Radio International. My shows and many other excellent shows. And I want you to dig this. You may hear all of Our Salon's programs, each of the podcasts. Listen at your leisure by going to www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes, one word, new episodes. And as always, I ask you to watch on Netflix the award-winning film OC-87. It is a brilliant journey and triumph, living with mental illness, directed by Bud Clayman, a friend of our program. If you were to write a review of the film, I would air it. Leading this week, I am honored to share a new piece from Greg Correll of upstate New York. Greg's work has graced our program from jump well over 3 years ago, and yet not in some time. I'd like you to listen to this piece with your interior eyes. Listen with your interior eyes and ears. See it. This is called Boys Don't Tell. In 1970, I ended up in jail in St. Louis. I spent the late 60s running away from my neglectful mom, then my abusive dad. When the police raided my last sordid crash pad and found felony narcotics, speed, acid, pills, pot, I was abandoned as incorrigible, an IV drug user. I was 14 years old. In Missouri at that time, there were last gasp facilities for the hopeless, impaired, and violent, not rehabilitative. They were way stations where boys 8 to 18 awaited sentencing to the infamous Boonville Correctional Facility, a place with a surreal tolerance of violence, later called, when investigations closed it forever, the most hellish 40 acres in America. I was there for almost 7 weeks. 2 weeks before my hearing, I was placed for 5 days in a special cell with 3 violent, depraved boys. During my 5 days, I was raped, repeatedly tortured and humiliated, and made to participate in my own degradation. When it comes to rape, boys don't tell. It was even truer then, but remains the standard in and out of facilities. Those older boys and the corrupt staff who protected them depended on our shame and silence. Several guards colluded. The rest were indifferent to what happened to us, the youngest, weakest, and prettiest boys. I am 61. It took me 44 years to speak of it, first to my wife, then a few friends, then regularly to a therapist who learned alongside me how one sorts out severe, long suppressed trauma. Last year I spent 4 days at a Garrison Institute workshop with the acknowledged modern expert on trauma, Bessel van der Kolk. He brought theater and music therapists too, and the event was a turning point for me. There were a couple of dozen survivors, but most of the attendees were clinicians, specialists in trauma. I was the only male survivor as far as I know. We met as equals and brave seekers. A few months later, I spent a long day at New York State's first ever workshop conference on male sexual trauma, and again, about 1/4 of the 120 attendees were survivors, but 3 of the 4 workshop leaders were survivors too. I was finally in the presence of men like me, men who stood up and were broken, visible, and true. Most had been molested, but several had experienced terrible violence like me. It was as if I could breathe with my entire lungs. At last, I was not alone. This is not an essay with lurid details. It is important to understand, however, what severe means for boys and men in lockup or anywhere if you are to understand what we overcome and how traditional definitions of wholeness and closure do not apply. We engage in healing behavior. We are not healed, ever. During my 5 days, I was raped repeatedly, tortured and humiliated, and made to participate in my own degradation. After begging for rescue on the 3rd day, I fought back that evening, thinking help was on the way. It was not, and things became more violent. I required corrective surgery, including a partial aneuploidy. Boys and men assaulted in facilities do not deserve it. They are not getting rough justice. It's rape. And a civilized society would not allow it. Men don't tell. I buried it, but had no hidden self. And I never forgot. I tried my best to follow everyone's advice and let it go. There was no context of PTSD or rape victims' rights in 1970. Decade after decade, I became a skilled actor, convincing myself I was okay. I raised my first daughter alone, then remarried and had 2 more daughters. I succeeded in life up to a point with career and home. All 3 of my daughters are ferociously funny, successful, smart, and strong. My late in life deterioration was typical, I've learned. I could not maintain my stoic, heroic self-identity forever because it was built on a lie. I was a great dad when they were young, but a frantic, anxious, withdrawn father when they reached adolescence, the age I was when things went so wrong. I struggled not to continue the cycle of abuse and succeeded, but barely. There are myths and assumptions about men who have been abused. Most, contrary to Hollywood and television stories, do not become offenders themselves, but we live in terror that we will, are secretly evil, dangerous, and prone to terrible error against loved ones. We internalize it, eat ourselves up with obsessive self-correction, or long hours of work, or compulsive self-sacrifice. We turn to drink and drugs, eat too much, and die early, just like our female counterparts who were abused and raped. There is another misconception about incarcerated men and boys in particular, a vile and pernicious one. I hear it among left and right wing friends equally, and in almost every movie and program. It goes like this: bad guy gets caught at last, good guy makes joke how Bubba in the bad guy's cell will make him his bitch. For some of us, this throwaway remark is a horror. Boys and men assaulted in facilities do not deserve it. They are not getting rough justice. It's rape. And a civilized society would not allow it. The victims of rape in jail are the weak, defenseless, and young. Remember this when you hear this so-called joke. Remember this when you blithely wish rape on a convicted rapist. Would you permit an extrajudicial system of violent assault against the weak just so it might at times add extra punishment to a bad man? Our culture refuses to pamper those in prison. We remain a Puritan, punitive culture that thinks they get what they deserve. We have barely begun to address what is aptly called rape culture for women generally. Men and women in facilities are ignored. Centuries from now, this era will be known primarily for our tolerance of rape. The PREA or PREA Act was passed in 2003 to address sexual assault in jail and prisons, but the number of reported rapes has risen every year nonetheless, and estimates suggest the actual number, given the lack of oversight in private prisons, to be as many as 200,000 per year. Besides the 70,000 children in government facilities and up to 100,000 in private facilities of different kinds, there are as many as 10,000 children in adult lockup on any given day. Remember them. The most conservative estimate is that 15,000 children, one every 35 minutes, are raped and assaulted each year in all these facilities. The reported confirmed number is under 1,200. Boys don't tell. Men don't tell. It took me 44 years. I blurt now, am inappropriate at times. When and where exactly is the right time and place to tell what happened? People look away, don't know what to say. But I will never be silent again. After I was moved to a different cell, I saw the boy who came after me out in the yard in the day room. He was 10 at most and destroyed like me. I could not protect myself or him or any of them. How could I in that place at 14? But rape lasts forever, and I will always believe I should have died trying. I will say here, friends, that Greg Carell, and I would have said this long before, and I've said this publicly, long before I had the honor of reading this, Greg Carell is the finest writer I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with in person. I look forward to more of his writing, and I hope, and I rarely say this to you, You know this, what I'm about to say to you. I hope you will share this. You know that my podcasts go to Facebook as soon as they are available to me from our network, from our salon. I want you to share this piece widely. It is that important. Thank you, my brave friend. Thank you so much. Now, friends, one sentence for those of you who delight in Trump analysis, and for those of you, even more so, for those of you like me who are damned impatient with our liberal friends analyzing him ad nauseum. Here's my one sentence. The simplest, most damnable error good people make in the face of fascists' blunt promises is to analyze those promises a cover for not wanting to believe those promises, a wishing away, enabling those promises horrid, immediate, midterm, long-term effects, embedding them in the culture, easing fascism's grasp, encouraging its gluttony. Now, from New York Review of Books, writer Masha Gessen, Autocracy Rules for Survival. This is what Mrs. Clinton did not say when she lost this election. Thank you, my friends. Thank you. We have lost. And this is the last day of my political career. So I will say what must be said. We are standing at the edge of the abyss. Our political system, our society, our country itself are in greater danger than at any time in the last century and a half. The president-elect has made his intentions clear, and it would be immoral to pretend otherwise. We must band together right now to defend the laws, the institutions, and the ideals on which our country is based. Well, that or something like it is what Hillary Clinton should have said. Instead, she said resignedly, we must accept this result and then look to the future. Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead. Our constitutional democracy enshrines the peaceful transfer of power. We don't just respect that, we cherish it. It also enshrines the rule of law, the principle that we are all equal in rights and dignity, freedom of worship and expression. We respect and cherish these values too, and we must defend them. And hours later, President Barack Obama was even more conciliatory. He said this, we are now all rooting for his success in uniting and leading the country. The peaceful transition of power is one of the hallmarks of our democracy, and over the next few months, we are going to show that to the world. We have to remember that we're actually all on one team, and the president added. The point, though, is that we all go forward with a presumption of good faith in our fellow citizens, because that presumption of good faith is essential to a vibrant and functioning democracy. That was Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Obama. As if Donald Trump had not conned his way into hours of free press coverage, as though he had released and paid his taxes, or not brazenly denigrated our system of government from the courts and Congress to the election process itself, as if, in other words, he had not won the election by acting in bad faith. Similar refrains were heard from various members of the liberal commentariat with Tom Friedman vowing, "I am not going to try to make my president fail," to Nick Kristof calling on the approximately 52% of majority voters who supported someone other than Donald Trump, quote, "to give President Trump a chance," unquote. As you probably know, people, Tom Friedman and Nick Kristof are extremely good writers for the New York Times. I happen to, as this writer does, disagree with their sentiments here. Even the politicians who have in the past appealed to the less establishment part of the Democratic electorate sounded the conciliatory note. Senator Elizabeth Warren promised to put aside our differences. That's a quote. Senator Bernie Sanders was only slightly more cautious, vowing to try to find the good in Trump, quote, "To the degree that Mr. Trump is serious about pursuing policies that improve the lives of working families, I and other progressives are prepared to work with him," quote, unquote. However well-intentioned, this talk assumes that Trump is prepared to find common ground with his many opponents, respect the institutions of government, and repudiate almost everything he has stood for during the campaign. In short, it is treating him as a normal politician. There has until now been little evidence that he can be one. More dangerously, Clinton's and Obama's very civil passages, which ended in applause lines, seemed to close off alternative responses to his minority victory. One of the falsehoods in the Clinton speech was the implied equivalency between civil resistance and insurgency. Let me say that again to you people. One of the falsehoods in the Clinton speech was that she implied that there is an equivalence between civil resistance and insurgency. That's just not true. You see, this is an autocrat's favorite con, the explanation for the violent suppression of peaceful protests the world over, because autocrats, fascists, see peaceful protest as insurgency. The second falsehood is the pretense that America is starting from scratch and its president-elect is a tabula rasa, or that we owe him an open mind. It was as though Donald Trump had not, in the course of his campaign, promised to deport U.S. citizens, promised to create a system of surveillance targeted specifically at Muslim citizens, promised to build a wall on the border with Mexico, advocated war crimes, endorsed torture, and repeatedly threatened to jail Hillary Clinton herself. It was as though those statements and many more could be written off as so much campaign hyperbole. And now that the campaign was over, Trump would be eager to become a regular rule-abiding politician of the pre-Trump era, but Trump is anything but a regular politician, and this has been anything but a regular election. Trump will be the fourth candidate in our history and the second in more than a century to win the presidency after losing the popular vote. The others didn't lie, by the way, people, about that popular vote, lie ad nauseum. He is the first candidate in history to win our presidency despite having been shown repeatedly by the national media to be a chronic liar, sexual predator, serial tax avoider, and race baiter who has attracted the likes of the Klan. Most important, Trump is the first candidate in memory who ran not for president but for autocrat and won. I have lived, Masha tells us, in autocracies most of my life and have spent much of my career much of my career writing about Vladimir Putin's Russia, I have learned a few rules for surviving in an autocracy and salvaging your sanity and self-respect. It might be worth considering them now. Rule number 1, believe the autocrat. He means what he says. Whenever you find yourself thinking or hearing others claiming that he is exaggerating, that is our innate tendency to reach for a rationalization. This will happen often. Humans seem to have evolved to practice denial when confronted publicly with the unacceptable. Back in the 30s, the New York Times assured its readers that Hitler's anti-Semitism was all posture. More recently, the same newspaper, the New York Times, made a telling choice between two statements made by Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, following a police crackdown on protesters in Moscow. The police acted mildly. I would have liked them to act more harshly, rather than those protesters, quote, their liver should have been spread all over the pavement. Perhaps the journalists could not believe their ears, but they should, both in the Russian case and in the American one. For all the admiration Trump has expressed for Putin, the two men are very different. If anything, there is even more reason to listen to everything Trump has said. He has no political establishment into which to fold himself following the campaign, and therefore no reason to shed his campaign rhetoric. On the contrary, it is now the establishment that is rushing to accommodate him. Our establishment, institutions, and leaders are now rushing to accommodate him. He has received the support he needed to win and the adulation he craves precisely because of his outrageous threats. Trump rally crowds have chanted, "Lock her up." They and he meant every word. If Trump does not go after Hillary Clinton, if he instead focuses, as his acceptance speech indicated he might, on the unifying project of investing in infrastructure, which, not coincidentally, would provide an instant opportunity to reward his cronies and himself, it will be foolish to breathe a sigh of relief. Trump has made his plans clear, and he has made a compact with his voters to carry them out. These plans include not only dismantling legislation such as Obamacare, but also doing away with judicial restraint, and yes, punishing opponents. To begin jailing his political opponents, or just one, Trump will begin by trying to capture members of the judicial system. Observers and even activists functioning in the normal election mode are fixated on the Supreme Court as the site of the highest risk impending Trump appointment. There is little doubt that Trump will appoint someone who will cause the court to veer to the right. There is also the risk that it might be someone who will wreak havoc with the very culture of the high court, and since Trump plans to use the judicial system to carry out his political vendettas, his pick for attorney general will be no less important. Rule number 2, do not ever be taken in by small signs of normality. Confronted with political volatility, the markets become suckers for calming rhetoric from authority figures. So do people. Panic can be neutralized by falsely reassuring words about how the world as we know it has not ended. It is a fact that the world did not end on November 8, nor at any previous time in history. Yet history has seen many catastrophes, and most of them unfolded over time. That included periods of relative calm. One of my favorite thinkers, the Jewish historian Simon Dubnow, breathed a sigh of relief in October 1939. He had moved from Berlin to Latvia, and he wrote to his friends that he was certain that the tiny country wedged between two tyrannies would retain its sovereignty, and Dubnow himself would be safe shortly after that. Latvia was occupied by the Soviets, then by the Germans, then by the Soviets again, but by that time Dubnow had been killed. He was well aware that he was living through a catastrophic period of history. It's just that he thought he had managed to find a pocket of normality within it. 3. Institutions will not save you. You know, it took Putin a year to take over the Russian media and 4 years to dismantle its electoral system. The judiciary collapsed unnoticed. The capture of institutions in Turkey has been carried out even faster by a man once celebrated, this is Mr. Erdogan, as the Democrat to lead Turkey into the European Union. Poland has in less than a year undone half a quarter of a century's accomplishments in building a constitutional democracy. Of course, the U.S. has much stronger institutions than Germany did in the 30s or that Russia does today. The problem, though, is that many of these institutions are enshrined in political culture rather than in law. And all of them, including the ones enshrined in law, depend on the good faith of all actors to fulfill their purpose and uphold the United States Constitution. The national press is likely to be among the first institutional victims. There is no law that requires the presidential administration to hold daily briefings, none that guarantees media access to the White House. Many journalists may soon face a dilemma long familiar to those of us who have worked under autocracies, as I have in Russia. Fall in line or forfeit access. There is no good solution, even if there is a right answer, for journalism is difficult and sometimes impossible without access to information. The power of the investigative press, whose adherence to fact has already been severely challenged by the conspiracy-minded, lie-spinning Trump campaign, will grow weaker. The world will grow murkier, even in the unlikely event that some mainstream media outlets decide to declare themselves in opposition to the current government, or even simply to report its abuses and failings. The president will get to frame many of the issues. Coverage and thinking will drift in a Trumpian direction, just as it did during the campaign when, for example, the candidates argued in essence whether Muslim Americans bear collective responsibility for acts of terrorism or can redeem themselves by becoming the eyes and ears of law enforcement. Thus was xenophobia further normalized, paving the way for Trump to make good on his promises to track American Muslims and ban Muslims from entering the United States. Rule 4, be outraged. If you follow rule number 1 and believe what the autocrat-elect is saying, you will not be surprised, but in the face of the impulse to normalize, it is essential that you maintain your capacity for shock. It is critical that you maintain your ability to be shocked. This will lead you into positions where people may well call you unreasonable and hysterical and accuse you of overreacting. It is no fun to be the only so-called hysteric in the room. You need to prepare yourself. Despite losing the popular vote, Trump has secured as much power as any American leader in recent history. The Republican Party controls both houses of Congress. There is a vacancy on the Supreme Court. The country is at war abroad and has been in a state of mobilization for 15 years. This means that not only Trump will be able to move fast, but also that he'll become accustomed to an unusually high level of political support. He will want to maintain and increase it. His ideal is the totalitarian level popularity numbers of Vladimir Putin, and the way to achieve that is through mobilization. There will be more wars. There will be more wars at home and, of course, abroad. Rule 5, do not make compromises. Like Ted Cruz, who made the journey from calling Trump, quote, utterly immoral and a pathological liar, to endorsing him late September, to praising his win as an amazing victory for the American worker. Republican politicians have, yes, fallen into line. Conservative pundits who broke ranks during the campaign are returning to the fold. Democrats in Congress make the case for cooperation for the sake of getting anything done, or at least, they say, minimizing damage. Non-governmental organizations, many of which are reeling at the moment, faced with a transition period in which there is no opening for their input, will grasp at chances to work with the new administration. This will be fruitless. Damage cannot be minimized, much less reversed, when mobilization is the autocrat's goal. But worse, it will be destructive of the soul. In an autocracy, politics as the art of the possible is in fact utterly amoral. Those who argue for cooperation will make the case, much as President Obama did in his speech, that cooperation is essential for the future. They will be willfully ignoring the corrupting touch of autocracy, from which the future must be protected. Rule 6. Remember the future. Nothing lasts forever. Donald Trump certainly will not, and Trumpism, to the extent that it is centered on Trump's persona, will not either. Failure to imagine the future may well have lost the Democrats this election. I'm going to say that one again. Failure to imagine the future may well have lost Democrats this election. I think that is so true. They offered no vision of the future to counterbalance Trump's all too familiar white populist vision of an imaginary past. They had also long ignored the strange and outdated institutions of American democracy that call out for reform, like the Electoral College, which has now cost the Democratic Party 2 recent elections. That should not be normal. But resistance, stubborn, uncompromising, outraged resistance, that is what ought to be normal. As I leave you today, I want to share again my one sentence that I shared earlier, because I think you need to take it in. The simplest, most damnable error good people make in the face of fascists' blunt promises is to analyze those promises a cover for not wanting to believe those promises, a wishing away, enabling those promises horrid, immediate, midterm, long-term effects, embedding them in the culture, easing fascism's grasp, encouraging its gluttony. Oh, you do see, yes you do, that we have a big job. All of you out there, you send me your stories, you, and you, right over there. You send me your stories, poems, essays. Send them to me, jwolf41387@aol.com. You must keep living as if justice matters now more than ever. As if what you and your kids do, it does matter. Be creative and courageous. Take your place on that great Mandela next to Bud Clayman and every one of our writers. And next to me, This is our brief moment of time. I want you to repair this crazy place, and you can. The poet Phil Oakes taught that we have to do it when, say it with me, while we're here. And yes, he was right. And I promise you, you see, that when you act on justice's behalf, it pays back. It may not pay back immediately, but it does pay back. And it will most definitely. As you work for justice, and when justice becomes light, it will make you happy. So let me remind you, as I ask you to join us again next week, you may hear all of our salon's programs at your leisure by going to www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes. And so please, always remember, here and everywhere, it's passionate justice.